I would start.
Right. Okay. So, well, let me officially wish you welcome to this roundtable, which will be focusing on the discussion of Terrell Carver's book on Marx. So it's a roundtable that is co-organized by two RCs, actually, two research committees, the RC33, which I chair, and that is concerned with the study of political science as a discipline, and the RC49 on socialism, capitalism, and democracy, which is chaired by James Chamberlain, who is also one of our speakers. So the roundtable, to provide maybe a brief introduction, is devoted to Terrell's book on Marx, which provides a different perspective to those of many handbooks and biographies that have been devoted to Marx. So Terrell seeks to emphasize the relevance of Marx to think about the present, and in order to do this, he starts from current issues and then works his way back to the way Marx conceived them and the subsequent reception of his work. So we will be talking about the book with the speakers that we have today with us, and that you can hopefully all see on your screen. The way we will do this is each of the speakers will take about 12 minutes to give comments on the book. Then Terrell will reply. And after that, we will still have about 45 minutes for Q&A, perhaps a second round of questions from the speakers, etc. Now, in terms of moderating the session, I will be distributing the floor to people, or giving the floor to people. The best way for the audience to ask a question, in my view, is for them to drop a line in the chat. I will not directly reply to that, but I will take note every time someone wants to ask a question. And when the time comes, I will give the floor to you, to participants to ask their question. Perhaps we'll do like, a series of 2-3 questions, and then Terrell will reply. We'll play it by ear as we go along. So I suggest that we proceed by the order of the program. Terrell will speak last, of course, but meaning that we would start with Marcela and then move on to Gökbörü. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right, if you forgive me, or maybe you'll tell me later. And then move on to Paulo, James, and finally Terrell. So if all that is clear, I guess we can start with Marcela whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Thibaut. First of all, thank you for the invitation to comment Terrell Carver's book. I am really honored to be here. And this is a very stimulating book. It is a reading that acknowledges the reader in every page, as it was almost pedagogical. If we could have a conversation with Marx, Terrell's book will be the mirror showing ourselves our own image in the dialogue. And it is a book deeply concerned with the reader's process, giving her all the information to access the sources that were used to sustain the affirmations made in the text. This is a book about Marx, deeply rooted in the concerns of today's audience. And as Carver stated in this book, there's no novelty in that part of the equation, since Marx has been frequently used with that purpose. But the novelty resides in that it isn't used here to make a contextual point and make it appear like it was an abstract and objective truth derived from an illuminated mind. Marx was a man of his time, and he is depicted in this way. But his writing can help us reconsider the pressing political issues of today, as Carver states in his book. Marx was passionate enough to speak the language of circumstances. He navigates between everyday injustices and abstract thought, and to understand him, we have to see what he was doing, not only what he was thinking. He was highly political, and his thinking was characteristic of a moment rather than always abstract. Considering that Marx was a man of his time is radical, not only because it moves away from previous approximation to Marx, but because it is radical in our own time, in our own academia. Are there pristine, pure authors? Should we only listen to those we consider pure to be valid? Can we learn something from flawed intellectuals? We are currently living a new wave of identitarianisms, essentialisms, with a reinvigorated liberal moral compass. There are subjects who are inherently valid to have a certain discourse and those who aren't. And there are strong frontiers separating them with their own intellectual patrols. But as Carver says, moralizing frameworks, as all intellectual phenomena, exist in a practical and social context. Even thought, sometimes they conceive themselves as timelessly, which is another way of oppression. In this scenario, taking back the context of Marx's remarks is extremely powerful and brave. We can learn from someone whose thoughts were embedded in his context, in his time. We can move forward in a radical standpoint, departing from the views of an intellectual who looked at liberalism with kind eyes in his time. And far from mainstream, as Carver states, that was the real sedition in his context. So, in my opinion, Carver's book addresses one fundamental question: who was Marx? But it does it in the light of another fundamental question, and that one is, who is Marx? While I was reading the first chapter, one anecdote came to my mind. Being an undergraduate student of political science in Uruguay, I wondered why Marx was absent of the syllabus. If he was mentioned, was almost to make a point in favor of another author. So I went to a lecture about him of a sociology professor. After that, on the same day, I went to a lecture given by a professor of social work. The two Marx depicted in the lectures were completely different. To take one of Carver's metaphors, the selfies taken said more about the hand carrying the camera. There were three Marxes that day: the abstract, complex social scientist that the sociology professor described, the political activist who should be an inspiration to committed professionals that the social work professor defined, and the absent one, the ghost in my political science syllabus. By the way, I think that Paulo's book gives us some powerful insights to understand this absence in our political science. But with this anecdote, I want to highlight another key point that Carver's book makes. Who built the political ideas that we understand as Marxists or as Marx himself? As Carver states, there were potent shifts in the reading of some iconic texts that contributed to make Marx an icon, like the Manifesto. The call to action made in the text was washed away to depict an abstract and academic picture of Marx, the one that the sociology professor gave me so many years ago. So, Marx's works were ordered and rearranged in a way that gave significance only to those that were aligned to an approach that wasn't his. And an encapsulated Marx was born. As Carver shows, Engels was fundamental in this operation, but not only him. The issue here, as Carver says in relation to the concept of theory of history, is not if these treatments are true, but to note how textual selection in relation to a theory was pursued as a valid academic style project in itself, for how such debates on theory were constructed as crucial in processes of political positioning in doing socialist and or revolutionary politics. And this approach is similar to the one that the second professor of my story took. Another key issue that I want to highlight is the power of Marx's discourse to transcend and to be appropriated by different actors, even though they don't identify themselves as Marxists. How Occupy Wall Street performed a Marxist discourse appears in different chapters of the book. So, Marx's ideas are present today, even if there's no one quoting him, and they are important to shape political action. The absence of the quote is very relevant and makes him more vivid. His view on differential access to income, wealth, and power became a substantial part of a radical way of looking at the world to challenge it, especially to the kind of activism that seeks to protect the future. And this is deeply in line with Marx's performative rhetoric that made a call for action from the point of view of the everyday people. He wasn't just describing things. As Carver says, he used and developed a view of knowledge as practice, practice as politics, and politics as future making. And he did this with a democratic writing rather than an authoritarian invocation of knowledge based on epistemological protocols guaranteeing certainty. So, moving away from the selfie of Marx that depicted him as an abstract social scientist whose more important contribution was to show how politics works, we have another selfie, the one of a deeply political intellectual with a performative rhetoric who focused on what politics should do. Some final remarks. At the beginning of the book, Carver says that Marx never goes away and he never will. But which one of Marx's selfies will transcend? Carver shows the complexity of taking the picture, framing it, and establishing it as a valid, legitimate one. His exercise is of deeply understanding Marx's language in the dialogue it was embedded with his interlocutors. They were relevant then, and they are relevant now. And I would like to add a personal note on the subject. The operation that makes the theory something transcendent dilutes the other. The interlocutor is not relevant. What is relevant is the abstraction. There's a language mining that also denies the author himself. There is an authoritative operation of the reader, editor, reviewer that is imposed on future readings. And in the same way that the other and the author are diluted, the authorship of the operation is also diluted. It is about marking what is important and what does not come into discussion for good readers. But while one operation conceals and disempowers, the other conceals, generating power. Carver also gave us insights to deconstruct moralizing political views, acknowledging its complexity. The chapter on Marx's take on exploitation and alienation is particularly useful to this end. Marx's critique was made to capitalism as a system, to capitalist relations, and all of this was understood performatively. The social question is addressed in a way that transcends individuals as such, an individual thought. And here we can see some powerful connections to other ways of approaching the social question, such as the one of non-identity feminisms or queer theory. We also must note that what is radical is historically constructed, and that Marx's discourse was performative of the terms that later framed our understanding of radicalism, as Carver states. And I'm quoting Marx on this: theory becomes a material force once it seizes the masses, as it did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcela, for perfect respect of the timing, as well as for your comments. Shall we move on to the next speaker, who should be Gökbörü?
Yes. Thank you. I was going to ask if you can hear me because it was breaking up for me for a second. Okay. So, well, Marcela, thank you so much. It was really, really amazing. And I'll echo some of the same points, but also I'll try to say some other things. And if I were to name my presentation, I think the title would be something like My Many Introductions to Marxism. Because since the age of 16, I've been introducing myself and later on others as I'm teaching to Marx, and I'm getting introduced again and again. So in this sense, what I want to do today is to think about this introduction to Marxism, to Marx rather, and I think that conflation itself is not just a slip, right? It happens quite advisedly oftentimes, and that's how we are taught. So what I'll try to do then is to remember some of my introductions, which really left important marks on me, and but also try to see how Terrell Carver's Marx is a bit different from these ones. Of course, I'll not be able to get into all of them, but I just want to say some of these names so that if you have read them, you have a bit of a framework. So here I'm thinking of Georges Politzer. That was the first introduction to Marxism I had, and it was elementary principles of philosophy. Marx's name is not even in the book, actually, right? The name of the book tells you a lot, because that's how it was, constructed. And then I had Ernst Fischer, Marx in his own words, I think later republished as How to Read Marx. Auguste Cornu, who wrote the first doctoral dissertation on Marx, his book, The Origins of Marxian Thought. Leo Huberman, The ABC of Socialism. Roger Garaudy of 60s and 70s, not the later, of course. Karl Marx, The Evolution of His Thought. Again, the thought aspect of it is just emphasized. And lastly, Bertil Ohlmann's Marxism, An Uncommon Introduction. And of course, here we're celebrating this book. So I'll try to just think about Carver's book in relation to these other introductions. And of course, I'm remembering the anti-Marxist Wilfredo Pareto, right, who said that Marx's words are like bats. One can see in them both birds and mice. And of course, this was the line that was taken up by Bertil Ohlmann and trying to show how actually this was not due to a lacking quality in Marx, but rather it was a necessary part of dialectics. But here, what I'm trying to think about is that Marx himself is also like a bit of a bat, that we could see birds, mouse, and other animals in it, but we often forget the human animal that was the activist in Marx. So what I'll try to do is the impossible that I'll try to, but just to give you an idea, and perhaps we could follow up on it, I'll draw on 5 things in terms of what Carver does differently. One I will call the from canon to organon, or organon, if you will, back to Marx himself, theory and practice, socializing epistemology as Marx's method, and contemporary politics. So what is common in these other works that I just cited and won't be able to speak, but if I'm granted a grant, so I'll also do this work on Introduction to Marxism as a research project, but here now I'll just speak to it in relation to Carver's book. What happens is that, and as Carver himself mentions it in his book, these other works are actually about canonizing Marx. But what Terrell Carver does for me is that moving this, and he himself talks about this decanonization, but the question is, how do we move from canon to organon? Of course, canon being the ordering of knowledge, and versus organon would be a means of acquiring knowledge, extending knowledge. And of course, this is important for us, for those of us who are working on race, racialization, coloniality, gender, sex, sexuality, and so on. This part of extending Marx, getting new knowledges of Marx is something very important. And of course, then what we need to remember is also canonization is a form of ideology, in the sense of not, of course, political ideology, but what Marx talked about in German ideology in the ruling class and ruling ideas section, of course, keeping in mind what Carver says about the construction of the text itself. So what happens is that then how do we do this decanonization, and how do we move towards that way of extending and acquiring new knowledge? Of course, we have an answer in Terrell Carver's Marx, which is that we go back to Marx himself. In some ways, it is the Husserlian things are going back to things themselves, right? So, and of course, here I'm remembering like Marcela, an anecdote when I was writing one of my qualifying exams, I was writing it on Marxism and the body. And my supervisor was laughing and telling me, you're so right doing it, because in Marxism, we have a head and feet. With head, we think, with feet, we worship and do stuff. So bringing this body of Marx, bringing Marx as a body and thinking of embodiment itself is quite interesting. And I think what Carver does here, because he brings in the full human being who is the activist, right? So once you do that, of course, that dichotomy between the head and the feet, the thing that we think and the organs that we work, right? That separation really disappears because it is always mediated by that body. And of course, how we do it here is that by unencumbering Marx from this rather undue burden of consistency, right? We're talking about a Marx who's supposed to be consistent from age 19, writing letters to his dad from his dying day. What kind of expectation is that? And which one of us could really, just undertake that kind of expectation? But this is the Marx we have who is cast in iron, right? Who's not changing, who's not alive. So what this book really brings in for me is that alive quality of Marx, thinking, changing, responding to his circumstances, responding to his own environment, right? And especially for those of us who are also in socialist politics, Marxist politics, this is something we need to do. However, what happens is that we are so caught up today with the questions of theory and practice, and we're not really reminding ourselves or minding that gap between theory and practice. And here in this book, what we see is that, to me, this is a huge warning saying that mind the gap, right? As you're stepping onto the subway, do not fall into the platform. You're not going to get the right practice or you're not going to get the right theory, and then you're going to do the right practice. This is not going to happen, he says. And of course, here then it opens us a huge vista, a horizon of change. Once we can really understand this difference between theory and practice, I'm not suggesting they are completely different, but just to remember that there are different genres. There are different genres of doing, there are different genres of making. Once we remind that to ourselves, what happens is that we have a horizon of social change that is not only bound to that cast in iron Marx, but rather the Marx who thinks, who changes all the time. And of course, how he does this is that, and I think perhaps this goes against Carver's book, but if I have to canonize one thing from this book, that would be that Marx's method. And not Marx's method in the sense that has been taken up by Lukács and company, but rather thinking about Marx's method as, and Carver says, I think on page 48 and 82, I thought I would read, but I feel like I'm talking a bit too much, I'm not going to read it. But what he says is that what we're doing is that socializing epistemology and historicizing epistemology, and elsewhere he actually says it's socializing epistemology and historicizing ontology. And I think this is a really, really good reminder for those of us who are trying to think today. We're trying to think with Marx, who's alive. And of course, once we do that, I'll just give you one example. For instance, the question of class, right? And I'm from Turkey. When the Gezi protests happened in Turkey, the question was, okay, this protest is amazing, but are the participants working class? What kind of social movement this is, right? We were so caught up trying to understand actually what class the participants were that we really did little time to be talking about how we can build on it, how we can mobilize it, and then we have the mess we call Erdogan today, right? And the same thing happened with various Occupy movements when I was in Canada, and that was going on in North America. And that lastly takes me to the question of contemporary politics. And Thibaut, I know you're watching me, but I think I have 4 minutes. I'll try to wrap it up. What I'll do is then to think that Marcela asked amazing 2 questions. Who was Marx and who is Marx? And I'm going to add another one to these questions to say that who's Marx, right? So this canonized Marx, who does he belong to? And I will argue perhaps a little polemically that this canonized Marx is the Marx of Western Marxism, because Western Marxists have already completed their identity politics, right? Because if we think of the colonization as a long identity politics done by the West, therefore producing this Western subject and subjectivity, and that is the Marx of that canonized Marx. They have done their identity politics. They have already produced. They're at the end of history in some ways, even though they say they are not. And they can look back and just see Marx in its totality. And of course, it's a concept that they use a lot. Carver doesn't use at all in this book. So this book in that sense then gives us the Marx that perhaps those of us who are located in other parts of the world and who need a Marx actually who can speak to the actualities, to the realities of our time. And again, then I'm remembering, for instance, this enormous backlash against intersectionality from mostly Marxist left, and of course this Marxist left being, Western Marxists mostly. And again, very parenthetically, I will also say that I really did not realize Marx was white until I came to Canada. Because back in Turkey, when we're thinking about Marx, when we're reading about Marx, when we're working about it, Marx was not a white person. He was just useful, right? Tran Duc Thao, the great Vietnamese Marxist, was saying that, well, we were already doing that work in relation to anti-colonial struggles. Marx just gave us a language, right? And this language comment, I think, also goes back to what Marcela was talking about. And really, we didn't think of him as this white thinker, and now we're trying to decolonize him in Canada, or we're trying to make him less white, etc. But that question itself comes, I think, and this book really shows it quite well, that with that kind of canonization. Whereas if we were to take this question of compromise, plus compromise, and not compromise in the sense of working with the fascists, that's not what Carver is suggesting, but perhaps it was understood as political united front and popular front and these kind of languages. But if you put, I just got my notice that I have 1 minute, so I'll just say it in 1 minute, that if we were to put this Marx with everything else, the real politics going on in North America, for instance, with Black politics, with indigenous politics, with gender and sexuality politics, we will really have an amazing Marx that we need. And I feel like Carver's book is a really, really good road to get to that Marx, and perhaps smack those to say that, no, you're not Marxist enough. We'll say, well, Carver says he was. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gökbörü, for comments that perfectly built on Marcela's own comments. So I think we have a pattern building up here, and I'm trusting on Paulo to follow suit. So Paulo, the floor is yours.
All right. Being here with all of you, celebrating Terrell Carver's Marx, it's just so amazing. I'm very, very excited, and yeah. All right. Thank you, Terrell Carver, for bringing this work into the world. I hope and believe that collectively we should make sure it's widely read and, more importantly, metabolized, not only within discussions around Marx, but also in broader explorations, especially on canon formation and genre instability, which are profoundly political issues. And that's going to be the focus of my reaction to the book. And yes, it builds on the other two presentations very well, and that's also good. I also hope that the text is translated into different languages for the reasons I'll explain later. So Carver's book illuminates Marx the Marxist, his everyday thinking and doing, as well as the Marxes and Marxisms that engulfed, obscured, and recreated Marx, erasing vital and productive ways to think about politics and struggle, freezing the volcano. And I agree that it's a very beautiful cover. We were talking about that with Divo before. Today, I would like to tackle 3 questions. What is this book? What does it do for Marx? And what does it do for us? As Carver says, this book is neither a biography of an intellectual who thought great thoughts, nor a textbook, what you need to know to be an intellectual. I think it's an exercise on critique and open-ended curiosity that inserts activity and hesitation into the core of the art of reading. The book contrasts its own openness to commentators on Marx who project academic, professional certitude into his authorial persona and then interpret his writing in that mode, ignoring their own disavowed hesitations. And can we really engage ethically without hesitation? It's only through hesitation that otherness can interrupt our authorial, sometimes authoritarian, certitudes. The unpacking of the historicity, contingency, and even arbitrariness of canon formation, in this case the Marxist canon, is more than just that. because it also opens the Pandora box of genre instability. This doesn't refer just to the choosing of the text and thinkers, but to the how of the engagement and the encounter with them and between us. A book offering this resists unproblematic insertions within the landscape of genres. Second point, what does this book do for us? Nobody owns her identity. That's okay. We know that from Hannah Arendt and many others. However, we are accountable for how we make others. What we do with our Marxisms after Marx the book, after encountering the notion that Marxism might be involved in the erasure of Marx. The story that many of us tell every day about the so-called economic and philosophical manuscripts, the Communist Manifesto, the engagement with Hegel, with political economy, are anything but transparent. Transparency is the erasure. One instance of the opacity of self-transparency is the very physicality of the so-called Marx collections and how all the texts look the same, from unpublished notes to self-contained books, which in some cases, however, became such through editorial decisions that retreat from our gaze. In some ways, Marxist conversations resemble the surface of exchange where Marx the commodity circulates, whereas this book dives into the practices that have constituted the realm of those conversations. And through this gesture, the book emancipates Marx, incompletely, of course, otherwise it would become dogmatic too. So I was saying that it emancipates Marx, not from, but through the mediations that made him. This is a powerful way of bringing contingency into Marx, and a very different way from the usual post-structuralist tics of presumptuous categories and obscure formulations. Carver introduced contingency through activity as the unifying force. Those who have been identified as great thinkers defeated those who are read as minor ones, or simply pushed into oblivion. However, Carver confronts the victor's loss of depoliticizing iconization. The fixation with reconstructive interpretation of the great thinker becomes sedimented human activity, canons and genres, that rule the activity of engagement, which becomes less and less active. Again, in contrast to this, Carver explores the mystery of the everydayness of Marx. Carver reminds us that the transferability of abstraction is linked to the room it gives for conceptual appropriation. And this is fruitful as long as we remember for real that we are doing the theorizing and that original sources don't speak by themselves. Forgetting this is even trickier, given that academic industries working through exegetical burdens speak through us, suppressing authorial voice and rejecting risk in order to get published. An interesting further project would be looking at how this constructedness of Marx has operated in different disciplines and contexts. Even though there is an aggregated story, so to speak, the process of making Marx Marx is textured through time, all sorts of mediations, and geographically bounded receptions. In some cases of Latin America, for example, the Sovietized Marx traveled to academia, and then Marxism in academia was deeply discredited by repentant Marxists who became liberals. I also remember professors in Uruguay, and I'm sorry, we're overrepresented here, clearly, telling students that Marx didn't write about politics, with the exception of the 18 Brumaire and the Manifesto. Of course, Marx journalism was not part of their menu. I want to close this section with a word about Marx the Democrat, and this is related to some of the things that Marcela was saying too. We know his ruminations on the relationship between property and representative institutions, the notion that humanity is self-constituted because its human activity disputes liberal conceptions of freedom. And, not but, and Carver also reminds that that Marx spent a lot of time supporting popular sovereignty in coalitional politics where a lot of concessions were made. This sort of anti-authoritarian legacy opens possibilities. What does this book do for us? Among other things, I think that it invites to relocate genre instability in unexpected places. Important as it is, the deconstruction of gender belongs to the broader project of genre deconstruction, not the other way around. When reduced to specific vocabularies and applied to predetermined realms of experience, genre problematization itself becomes ossified. Besides being oxymoronic, this is unfortunate as it iterates divisions between culture and economy. These divisions refract activity as well as the integrated condition of our lives, which don't follow the separation with which academic disciplines organize them. Particular jargons monopolize the critique of genre formation, which is then forced to carry too much postmodern weight. Marxist resistance to this important task also collaborates in making this task foreign to discussions on political economy. So the focus on activity that is always already intellectual and material, brings clarity to this challenging landscape. If we turn our attention to activity, it becomes clear that the very rules of engagements anywhere and about anything are made by humans, and they can be undone by humans. In other words, genres regulating human encounters are sedimented and aggregated human activity. Self-erased human activity lies behind any form of reification, and something liberating happens when we notice that, because we now know that we can confront this through activity. This critique needs to be done where we find resistances and where it seems more challenging, perhaps more impertinent. It is hard work, but possible work, as Carver shows. To finish my intervention, I have 4 questions or provocations for Carver and everyone. First, the difference between canon and genre. I'm referring to texts now. My impression is that one can expand the canon while keeping the rules of engagement untouched. To be blunt, genre is deeper, or is a deeper issue than canon. Second, if we conceive the linear and conceptual temporality, thinking first, action after, as made by humans, the realms of action and thinking mesh. So to say that universities, for instance, are the site for thinking and real-world activism is the realm of action reinscribes the segmentation, sometimes in radical anti-intellectual language or anti-academic language. Paradoxically, this gives academics green light to go for business as usual and to hold onto narcissism and possessive individualism in the name of critical theory. But academic and intellectual encounters are experiences that project worlds. I wonder, for instance, about the role of the classroom in this regard. And I also wonder if Carver, in this book, takes for granted what academia does and is, and if instead we need to reclaim it. Third, I believe that complexity and nuance have democratic value. Is there a tension between this idea and the performative character of rhetoric? In some occasions, the book refers to instances in which Marx called for action, and to do so simplifies issues. And I'm puzzled by the relationship between action, rhetoric, and complexity. Is it possible to develop a discourse that engages complexity while it calls for action? In the same direction, was iconization needed for Marx to become a political force? Because iconization seems to depoliticize, but also politicize at the same time. Finally, what is the relation between this book and post-structuralism? Can the so-called linguistic term really capture activity? And for now, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Paulo. We have one last speaker before moving on to Terrell, and that will be James Chamberlain.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Just gonna, yep, excellent, thank you. So thank you, Paulo, for organizing this session and for giving us the opportunity to think about this book. I have to admit that it's been quite a challenging book for me to think about in terms of what to say. You know, I read it, I was captivated by it, but coming up with any kind of critical comments I found really challenging. So I hope I can offer some questions and kind of ambiguities that occurred to me as I was reading it and as I've been thinking about it, so that we can have a conversation around that. So one point is that Carver explains that his book doesn't try to determine what Marx would say about contemporary politics, but instead to show how reading Marx can help us think again, or stimulate me to think again. I think at times the difference between those two approaches is not entirely clear. And this is one of the sort of ambiguities or tensions in the book and in the project of the book that I find quite interesting. What is the difference between being stimulated to think again by Marx and saying what Marx might actually think about the present? Carver himself doesn't entirely resist the temptation of giving voice to Marx. In one place, he suggests that Marx would have been Occupy Wall Street, yet would have been nonetheless critical of what the movement said. So is that kind of one exception that Carver allows himself to his general rule, or is he doing something different there than giving voice to what Marx would actually say? Generally, as others have noted, he intends this to be a set of essays on topics to think about when reading Marx. The index of success, as Carver puts it, is whether the reader's attention wanders off Marx and considers the pressing political issues of the day. I think that's a great challenge or a great sort of goal to set, but it's also almost one that is unfair on the author, Carver himself, because the book is substantially about Marx. So I personally found that as I was reading the book, I was thinking a lot about Marx, and my attention didn't really wander off Marx that much. Perhaps a little bit when I got to the parts where Carver was talking about Occupy Wall Street and some other contemporary examples. But I guess perhaps the real index of success would be after reading the book and after talking with others about it, to what extent I'm able to kind of build on that. And maybe others had a different experience of reading it as well. The other purpose of the book, as I understand it, is to displace the familiar figure of Marx the great thinker and to propose an alternative Marx the activist. Probably this isn't a fair comment to make, but I thought I would just point out that it's kind of ironic that the book is published in a series called Classic Thinkers. I wonder what Carver thinks about that. Still, the cover is not an image of any Marx, whether the great bearded Marx or the young handsome, energetic young Marx or any other Marx. It's a volcano, so perhaps that was deliberate. I'd be curious to see what sort of decision-making went on for that. This Marx the activist, I think, is key, and other contributors have already sort of highlighted some aspects of this. I do sometimes find that the distinction between Marx the activist and Marx the grand theorizer or the intellectual is not always as clear as I would like as well. If you're grand theorizing, is that not possibly also a form of activism? What exactly is Marx's activism? Carver says at the end that recontextualizing works as intrinsically and immediately political means recognizing that they have specific target audiences in mind and messages tailored accordingly. And I think that that's, as Carver himself shows, a really important kind of reading protocol if we're going to get Marx right. But getting Marx right isn't what Carver wants us to try to do, or claims that he is doing. It's not that this is the right Marx, it's just that this is a different Marx, or at least that's what I understood Carver to be saying. By focusing on Marx the activist, Carver does show some really interesting things I found, for example, about problems with the treatment of and the reception of Marx's texts, like the Communist Manifesto. Carver says presenting a logic of action. Are you for or are you against? Rather than trying to, this is a quote, satisfy descriptive criteria so as to be quote unquote accurate. And as Carver points out, this kind of overlooking of the logic of action leads people, commentators, to treat rhetorical claims as descriptive, and then to kind of reframe what Marx is doing in social scientific terms, creating epistemological puzzles, and quoting here, and empirical tests prior to any practical political modes anyone might be considering. And just as another sort of anecdotal point, as others have made, my first encounter with Marx was actually at the same university that Terrell teaches at, but in the philosophy department, and it was sort of the analytic Marxism. And I went back and looked at one of the key texts, and the blurb for it, this was by Keith Graham, was I can't remember what was the title of the book. I can't remember. I should have looked at this. But anyway, in the blurb, it basically said trying to explain Marx's ideas more clearly than he did himself. Right. So there's this sort of attempt to distill the essence that Carver's talking about, very much there in this sort of social scientific reframing. Anyway, one question I had about this is, I mean, I know that Carver's talking about more than just accuracy and the logic of action when he makes this point about activism, but I mean, doesn't activist writing also require accuracy? Doesn't a lack of accuracy sort of count as a reason to dismiss an argument, even if it's one that is presented to activists? On the other hand, could contemporary radical politics stand to gain more from this kind of rhetoric that Marx uses in Communist Manifesto? And then what place, if any, would this kind of writing that Carver emphasizes Marx is doing have within academia? I mean, is that something that is possible or even desirable within academic writing? One reason why Carver says that we can't just apply Marx's thinking about capitalism to the present day is because Carver says the very thing that Marx is critiquing, political economy, is not what we now inhabit in terms of modern economics. And I found this to be really quite fascinating, Carver's description of kind of the way that marginalism and modern economics really changes the terrain of economic thinking, so that this question of value and Marx's theory of exploitation and the source of profit doesn't really have the same pertinence, even within a few years of when Marx wrote it, because that's the paradigms being overturned within the 1870s. I think this leads then Carver to say, well, so what can we do with this theory of profit and exploitation? And he says on page 150, it's open to us to see the point of some of his conclusions and possibly use those within our own terms today without being unduly concerned to defend each and every point through which the argument proceeds. And this kind of just made me think, well, you know, what should people who are interested in contemporary capitalism and who are interested in critiquing contemporary capitalism do with Marx? Is it even really worth reading Marx given this? Why not just read, you know, Iris Marion Young, Nancy Fraser, any number of other contemporary critical theorists, given that they are engaging with actually existing contemporary capitalism, when all we can do with Marx is kind of loosely work with some of his accounts, given that his circumstances were so different. I'm not sure how I'm doing on time, but there's one other main point that I think I'd kind of like to make, and that is this really interesting reception argument that Carver makes about the so-called young Marx, the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, and the fact that these were editorially fabricated in the 20th century, and then obviously take on a particular significance in the West and in Eastern Europe in the 1960s. Carver, I think, shows how very precisely because of their sort of distance from the more economic writings, these sort of seemingly more philosophical writings have a kind of transcendence that appeals to authors and activists in very different circumstances. So it doesn't matter so much that their societies don't slot into the sort of class structure that Marx was talking about, or the mode of production that Marx was talking about in some of his other writings. Obviously, when they do that, these authors are kind of turning Marx's half-baked ideas into a quote-unquote philosophy. So they're decontextualizing Marx's thoughts. But I guess my question for Terrell is there anything actually wrong with that? And part of the reason I'm asking that question is, given that doing that actually did have practical political impact, wouldn't Marx himself be happy about that, given that the point of philosophy is to change the world? Even if in doing that, they've kind of, in a sense, missed the point. Okay. I think one of the really interesting points is this difference between coalitional, or the emphasis that Carver places on Marx's interest in engaging in coalitional politics, and the way that this kind of dichotomy between radical politics and liberal politics nowadays doesn't really make sense for Marx. And I think that is one way that Carver's book can show that, I think someone made this point earlier in a way, perhaps someone could criticize you for not really being a Marxist if you appear to be too sympathetic to liberalism, but actually in some ways you could say, well, Marx himself was, pretty on board with some liberal ideas. So I think it can kind of show that actually what it means to be Marxist, if one can be Marxist, is not really to be in favor of either radical protest or compromise, but to respond to the situation at hand. So I think just kind of by way of conclusion here, why read Marx today is a question I think that Carver poses, for me at least. And it almost seems, and I say this not entirely seriously, but it almost seems like Carver is so successful in his project that it's almost not worth reading Marx at all today. I was going to try and argue that in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, because once we contextualize him in these ways, he seems to have nothing much to say to us, one could argue. I don't actually think that entirely, but that was kind of a thought that I had. And I do think sometimes I was frustrated reading this to kind of see, okay, what am I to do with Marx now? And obviously Carver can't tell us what to think about Marx, because that would go against his project of trying to use Marx to think for ourselves again. So that does lead to this question then of, what should academics make of Marx? Should we write about Marx anymore? Because when we write about Marx, aren't we perpetuating a kind of another canon, if you will? Or should we just have these really sort of loose engagements with Marx, where we read Marx, think about it, and then go away and kind of write things inspired by Marx, but without really, doing anything much that's very textual about Marx? Maybe Carver, his book is the only book that should be written about Marx anymore, because more books about Marx are just going to create more Marxes, and perhaps what we don't need are more Marxes, but ideas stimulated by Marx. I think I'm going to stop there, actually. So thank you very much. I hope that some of my comments made sense and that we can carry on talking about it.
Thanks a lot, James. Well, Terrell now has a lot of it on his plate, I guess. So I'm going to give him the floor so he can tell us what to do with Marx.
Okay, many thanks to Thibaut and Paulo, and indeed to everybody. This has been an absolutely amazing and quite wonderful and indeed moving occasion. One of my mantras is if you're not laughing, you're not learning. And I was in stitches of laughter by the time we got to the end of that. I won't go through everything that I've learned, but every single sentence or comment from everybody along the line has something to teach me and something I've enjoyed listening to. And I will come back to what strike me at the moment as some of the major concepts that are my takeaways. Anyway, I'm quite glad this has been recorded so that I can go back to it to learn some more. So thanks very much for the intro, the segue, James, into the book and the series and the book cover, because there are some stories there. This was proposed as a book by editor at Polity Press, and I was quite flattered by the interest, but I did say, well, if you're going to ask me to write a book about Marx, it's not going to be like anybody else's. And I think I've pretty well succeeded in that, given the kind of conversation that it stimulated. So I'm really, really pleased with that. And George at Polity said, well, that's okay. And so then he explained a bit more on the email and said, it'll be in the Classic Thinkers series, and that's a philosophy series. And my response was, well, you know, the whole idea is he's not a philosopher. It was made into one, and that in lots of ways that now seems very regrettable. So this isn't going to do at all well. And I mean, George said, no, that's fine. I'm really happy with that. So that's why it's in that series. The story about the cover, I'm really glad to have a hook to talk about that one, because eventually further down the line, the production department gets in touch about covers, and so I wanted, there should be no surprise, a sort of class struggle of the everyday and the revolutions that make or try to make democratic politics of Marx's time and later years, and right up to the moment, as many here, a number of people here and in the audience can testify that this is very much an ongoing activity. And in writing the book, I tried to displace some of the more familiar concepts that Marx gets stuck with, and took the liberty to project one onto him, which was the social question, as it appears in English, and doesn't appear in exactly that form. So I thought, in terms of people today getting into Marx without learning an unfamiliar vocabulary, or vocabulary that's become rather stale, that might do. So in looking around for an image on the cover, I suggested some and got a swift reply saying, we can't have human figures on the cover. We can't have human beings, because all the other books in the series have nature. I thought, well, I'm not terribly good with that concept, but let's have a look at the other books in the series. And unsurprisingly, the nature that you see in all the other books is actually gardens or gardening. I love gardening, but I do think it's, you know, deeply, and I will use the word advisedly, wrong to consider nature as gardening. And I've had a few local blow-ups on that particular subject. So of course people can say what they like, but then they have to listen to what I think about it. And one of my favorite passages, and perhaps a reason for reading Marx, is that some of it is just so fresh and freshly expressed. in the one of his chapters in the Holy Family, he's critiquing philosopher, activist, politicos would be for talking about nature, and he says, just look out the window. This may be when he's talking about Proudhon, maybe in Poverty of Philosophy, I've forgotten at the moment. It says, look out the window, everything there is man-made. The trees, the grass, the flowers, they're cherry trees, I think, you know, get real. I mean, I think that's just really fresh and wonderful, and of course fits in with a lot of what people have discovered, more or less independently of that particular long buried remark about nature. So anyway, I thought, okay, I will go with the program and we'll have nature on the cover. What I really want, you know, is a metaphor. And I want a metaphor that's going to express something that advances, as Marx hoped the class struggle would, indeed sweeping up other struggles that we've mentioned along the line, even if he hadn't thought of them yet. And as something that's got a force to it that just can't be turned back, and that doesn't move too quickly. But you can't resist it. So the tsunami in Japan came to mind in that respect, and there are the videos of this huge wall of water, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it but run to a nearby hill. It's just everything is gone in front of it. And so I went back with that. And the photo designers for book covers came back and said, well, here's a whole bunch of tsunamis, including, of course, Hiroshige's Great Wave, naturally. And I thought, well, that's okay for a metaphor. But they did say it's going to make it look like a surfing book. So I took the point, and they said, how about volcanoes? So I said, okay, that sounds a good idea. I have visited a few, and they are impressive and hot. So I actually chose that particular image, which turned out to be great because you can see it all the way across the room at a book exhibition. So I thought that was a good choice. And about 2 weeks after it was published, for some reason I had paperback Marx in translation open, and I was reading from the English language article or speech for the People's Paper in 1850, which is, of course, in the aftermath, or, you know, they didn't know it was the aftermath, but in a sense, in the thick of democratic populist struggles of the day. And what happens in the first sentence or two of that? Marx starts talking about volcanic eruptions, and the class struggle is, you know, a volcanic eruption that arises out of the earth and has all that strength behind it. So I thought, that's a way of channeling Marx. So, and that was actually quite unexpected. So, reflecting back on the conversation today, and I very much like the conversation idea, I think we've had a wonderful conversation with Carl. And I think he's been here, and that was really what was meant to be going on in the book, and I think everybody got it. There may be doubts and instabilities and uncertainties along the way as to how exactly that is possible, but then that demonstrates the point that we should be taking about conversation, is that we should be very careful about the boundaries and barriers and concepts that are put up to stop us having conversations. One of which is, well, this is the present and that was the past. Another is, well, we're all alive and he's dead. Well, you know, I say with all due respect, nuts to that idea. We can all perfectly well have a conversation. The conversations are going on in our heads anyway, as reader interpreters, when I'm hearing what you say and you're hearing what I say. And I write a book and you read it, and we're all surprised. because different people are getting messages and in different ways, and we think different things about it, and that's really the nature of human activity, as I see it, and activism. And I think that's something that the linguistic turn and various other ideas, movements, and concepts that have been going on in the last 120 years or so has been getting across. And I don't think any particular person takes all the credit for putting that together. And sometimes, because of these genre barriers, they're made to seem like they can't talk to each other, or they have to keep it hidden, or that it's not going to work, or that it's not allowed, or it's not a proper subject for an essay, or you won't get 100 on the test, or your friends will be puzzled, or any number of other things. So I'm encouraging people to make conversational efforts to speak in and around and through all of that kind of thing. The point about hidden, just another quick anecdote. I was asked to write for a reference book on post-Marxism and asked to do the chapter on Judith Butler, which I thought was an interesting idea to start with, and was a kind of, good choice, kind of dream project for me. So, and it was only 4,000 words or something. So I got into that, and I had done some work on this before, but it had surprised me a few years previously how much classic political theory there is in Butler, even if it does all seem to be French and German phenomenology and deconstruction. And reading through some sections of Bodies That Matter, I thought this is sounding really familiar. Buried in the end notes, way at the end of the book, is a reference, perfectly good one, to Theses on Feuerbach. So sometimes people don't advertise this kind of stuff, and I know this is dangerous territory and not everybody's favorite person, but there is an activist public intellectual there. Not just writing, but actually standing up in some difficult contexts and saying difficult kinds of things. And I did go to an event like that shortly after 9/11, for instance, when speaking up in that kind of context as an American was difficult. So I'm not thereby proposing to write this kind of book about Butler, or particularly to follow all the ins and outs of her subsequent appearances as a public intellectual. But I think that speaks to some of the questions here that have come up about what actually is activism and how does that relate to the academy and to being an intellectual. And genre transgression is a good angle on this. And that, of course, performs genre instability. So that is one of the things that self-consciously I was trying to do here, just as a way of kickstarting people on political subjects. And I think I've had some, I know I've had some success today from what's happened. So I will see if I can activate the chat so I don't miss any cues, since I've got rather excited and have moderator chat, so I'll have a look at that. So I'll wait to hear from Thibaut about this. Last minute, he says, okay. Well, this brings me to the segue to political science, which kind of performs and demonstrates what I've been talking about, because I wasn't particularly expecting to hear that come up as a concept, and I'm thoroughly delighted because it leads on to the roundtable on Paulo's book. And I think science is itself a genre and a barrier and a boundary line. And there's a lot of ambiguity about Marx on that particular subject, and a lot of contextual conversations we could have. But this book was intended to speak to all kinds of people in all kinds of disciplines, so I'm delighted it's got some traction in that respect. So just here on a memorializing moment, some of you will know of Leo Panitch, who edited the Socialist Register for many years, and was for me a very stimulating dining and drinking companion. And that's another public intellectual in academia, and so I think very influential in helping people to think about the social question over the years. So, I mean, my view of him was that he was far from dogmatic, but his marks had been fixed to quite a degree in the kind of education and books that he mentioned, that others have talked about their own education. And what surprised me the last time I saw him, I think, and I sent him a PDF or something, and he said, "I really liked your book." And I thought, well, that's really quite unexpected, and I thought that was a major tribute. So I've had further tributes from the living here, and I just thought I'd add my version of from one who has really sadly recently died. So thank you very much, and I'm very honored by this. Over to you. Back to Thibaut.
Thanks a lot, Terrell, for your stimulating response and the anecdote about the volcano, of course, which we all enjoyed. No one in the audience has raised a hand yet, so please feel free, just drop a line in the chat so I can open your microphone. Other than that, if some of the panelists want to again drop a quick question or something. Oh, John Thing has raised his hand. Let me try and bring him live. It would seem I can't. Okay, so he has dropped a question in the chat. So here it is. Who is
not
Karl Marx?
connected? He's I think he mentions that even in the question. Okay.
Yeah. So the question is, it's following Marcela's comments. So he says he would like to ask a following up question: who was Karl Marx? Can we have the same answer, or do we have to have the same answer? I mean, Marx died a long time ago, and we probably cannot know what he actually thought about a specific issue. We understand and explain Marx in our own contexts: historical, temporal, social, political, and even cultural, geographical. For example, David Harvey has a quite different view from Professor Carver. So what do you think? So that's one point. And the second point, he would like to ask Terrell a rather trivial question. What do you think about the film Young Karl Marx? So I guess maybe Marcela and then Terrell? Or the other way around?
Whatever you like.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for this. It was really enjoyable, as Terrell said. And I was thinking about, well, the question, but also some of the things that the discussion arised. And what you said about Marx being a body and Terrell saying it is alive, and well, it has to do with the question, because if he is alive and it can move, it can change, and if you allow me, since you quoted Butler, to queer Marx, that body is more than a material reality, becomes a materialization of possibilities. And I would like to make another question regarding this, because I made a statement in in my intervention, and I want to rephrase it as a question to Terrell, because I said before that it was possible to think in connections between Marx or Terrell's Marx and non-identity feminisms and queer theory, but do you agree with that? And especially thinking about what Paulo said about canon and genre, and I was thinking about what's the meaning of changing the system for these theoretical and activists.
And I think that builds on Gökbörü notion of canon versus organon. That was really, I think that would take all those interventions go in the same direction.
Okay, I think we're coming back to me. Well, I think we're all texts, and we all speak.
Have we lost Terrell?
Oh, have you?
No. I hear him.
You hear him. Thibaut and I have had some audio issues. So I was saying, I think we're all texts and we're all subject to interpretation. And in that respect, it's not that much different reading a text and hearing a voice than it is seeing people on a flat screen and absorbing textually and with perhaps a bit more visual performance. That as a way of stimulating what it is we're thinking. So I'm simply rejecting the kind of living stroke dead barrier, and that was a long time ago, and this is now. Why bother to read Marx at all? Well, I think there are just a lot of similarities in the issues, and I think lots of the struggles are really very similar, and we cut ourselves off from a certain kind of distancing exercise that's possible, even if the distance is in time instead of or as well as of space. So we could talk about democratic struggle in Uruguay, we could talk about class struggle in South Africa, we could talk about any number of things. And I don't see the need to draw a particular line. If it works in terms of what is said and connects to us many times in translation anyway, then I don't see a problem with that. So lots and lots of people do find Marx a very invigorating writer, and there's much more interest now in him as a writer than there used to be, and as a rhetorician. So rhetoric does a job, and I come into it from there, or it's trying to do a job, and that goes back to conversation, which is rhetoric. And part of rhetoric is telling people they're inaccurate. And it's a good thing to do that and to make your argument of that case. So I was reading Simon Schama's reflections this morning on various topics in American politics, and it's safe now to do so, but he said it's really important for historians not to do guilt tripping on themselves, but to call out what Donald Trump said about airports in 18th century America and various other horrendous anachronisms and falsehoods. So nobody is saying these concepts have no use anymore, or that no one is entitled to use them, and that they don't have meaning. So I think we could get going in various ways on that might look and sound quite philosophical. But then we are, in territory where Marx was very good, even though he didn't set himself up then in his own time and adopt the rhetorical authority of a philosopher. In fact, he rather interestingly rejected it. So there is a kind of philosophizing of a non-philosophy here, and of reflecting on that as a possible way to do activism. So some forms of activism produce complexity, and others simplify. And I mean, Marx was reasonably adept at both. I mean, he wasn't all that perfect at it. And it's just useful to have that revivified in our minds and to go back through the text. I'm pleased to say that this Marx book is being or has been translated into at least a couple of languages. I know for sure it's gone into Chinese, and rather surprisingly, this kind of approach gets traction in amongst people in China, of whom there are possibly millions or even more involved in more or less academic and quite politicized conversations on this kind of subject, but they're not as formulaic as you might think from the reportage. Did I like the movie? I didn't actually like the stage play that was put on in London, although I actually refused to see it, but I read the reviews and looked at the poster and had conversations with some people who had seen it. And so I'm rather pleased I didn't waste my time on that, because my theatrical friends described it as a romp, and that anachronism to that degree kind of appalls me. No doubt the jokes were funny. I do think laughter is good. The film was rather better, so I'll say just briefly, for me it had two good qualities. One, it started in exactly the right place, with the peasants in the forest and the mounted military getting rid of them, and that's quite a familiar image of dispossession that certainly comes up in academics and other discussions quite a lot, and also the characters in the drama speak French and German a lot to each other indifferently. And I thought that was actually quite good and very true to life. I mean, of course, movies and all that kind of thing is artifice anyway, but I thought it was good given the kind of global Anglophone framing of films into genres like biopics and docudramas. I thought it was rather good to have it reach me anyway, but in that format, admittedly, with subtitles. After that, I think it goes badly off. And it takes a while to explain why. It has much more to do with Engels than Marx, so I'll kind of skip that unless you're particularly interested. So I'll hand back at that point to Thibaut.
Thanks, Terrell. There's a follow-up question from Gökbörü. I see that Kevin Hockmuth has also raised his hand, but I cannot seem to bring him live, so I would encourage him to write up his question in the chat if possible. So Gökbörü, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you, Thibaut. And I feel like I've cheated. It's really not a question, just a follow-up. So, and since all that talk of, genre crossing, I feel permitted to remember a few things in different genres. For instance, I'm thinking, or if you remember what Gertrude Stein was saying about her own line, that a rose is a rose is a rose, right? So she was saying for the first time in the English literature, rose was red again. So in reading this book again, Carver's Marx, a Marx is a Marx is a Marx is a Marx. So I feel like perhaps not for the first time, but I think recently we really had Marx as Marx. And I think that's important to think about the question of James, because he was asking them what to do with Marx. Is it even useful that we should think of him, read him, write on him, etc.? And I think that choice is up to us, really. And the question is, what kind of greatness are we looking for? Is Marx great? Yes, absolutely he is. Because I'm coming from a place, and I know so many others, in the tricontinent, for millions on his name went out the streets, made amazing changes, made history. Isn't he great? Yes, he is. but what kind of greatness, right? And then moving on to another genre, right? Just go to biblical images, or to, again, just Marcela's view on queerness, right? Like thinking of Garion and the grandson of, Medusa and nephew of Pegasus, right? And who was killed, by Hercules in his tent labor. But Anne Carson writes that story again for today, where Garion is in a queer threesome, right? So then how are we bringing these heroes, these great people who are actually not that great, right? Of course, we remember Hercules, but not necessarily Garion. Or are we okay with kind of a Lazarus, that who's, resurrected, but who's stumbling, who's trying to wake up, etc.? Can we take Marx, not as Christ, but perhaps as Lazarus, thinking of him coming alive, brought him back by the spirit of the time? And again, Colm Toibin in his book, The Testament of Mary, has this amazing moment where he talks about Lazarus being alive, coming alive, but he's feeling weak, he's disoriented. Are we okay with that kind of Marx? Are we okay with him bringing him back into 21st century to a place that he has no idea what it was? And of course, I'm then remembering of Marx in Soho, right? Speaking of plays and films, etc. Marx is, brought back into Soho in New York, and then trying to make sense of it, right? Not Soho of his London, but of New York. So then the question is really for us, then do we have to read Marx as a philosopher after Carver's kind of cleaning of the area for us? Or could we go back to him as a methodologist? And I feel like for my part, what's important is that, to be able to resuscitate him as a methodologist, and then see perhaps what through his method we can do, as opposed to, throwing Marx with the bathwater and keeping the water and seeing what to do with that.
Thanks, Gökbörü. I have two other questions coming up from Kevin Hockmuth and Paulo, so I'll give them the floor, and then we can go back to Terrell. Kevin, I think you should be up. Yes, sure.
I don't know if I'm going to get a pass for that. So first of all, thank you to everyone for the panel. It was really interesting. I consider myself, I guess, an amateur reader of Marx. I don't think I have quite the professional aptitude of all of you, and certainly the author Terrell Carver. And I unfortunately have not been able to read the book yet, but I'm certainly going to look forward to reading it over the break in August. So thank you. The question, I guess, kind of maybe builds a little bit off of James's comment about the kind of, so do we need to or read Marx at all, or is what, how does he filter into our understanding of the present or even the more recent historical epoch? And I guess one angle I was interested to hear Terrell or anyone else on the panel comment on is how, this notion of how the rise of the quote unquote service economy. And for me, my Marx, I guess we all have our Marx, maybe that's what we're learning here. But for me, my Marx is always, I've always been fascinated by his focus on the relationship between our work and our humanity, and that essential, like our essence as human beings and our work, and how integrated that is, and how that just base insight filters into this notion of the service economy. And if you allow me just a minute, I mean, it kind of my heuristic for this, now living in Japan for 6 years, is convenience stores. I don't know if you guys have ever been to Japan, but I live next to a Lawson, and the amount of work at a convenience store, I was a 7-Eleven clerk once upon a time. So I have and that involved a way different skill set than, I mean, I get my packages there. They handle money. I pay my bills there. I mean, they cook food. They're cooking fries. I mean, they have like a deep fryer. So and I just watched the insane amount of work, and I don't know. I tell my students, like, when you start going down these roads, like these everyday interactions start becoming all weird to you, and I get like weirded out, and like I was putting money in a cash machine, like while someone was standing there, and it just, I don't know, just gets strange. And so that weird transgress, kind of side, like, how does this relate? Like, how does these kinds of, and I guess I'm implying that I think it has profound effects, in that we're like not even, even like the factory person who is doing like division of labor and doing like one little thing is like still doing something, but now we're producing abstractions. And I guess we can even like, in building from kind of Paulo's take, and I saw him speak at the last IPSA, and I really like his interesting view. I mean, with turning the lens on ourselves, like what I always ask my students when we talk about Marx, like, what am I producing right now? I don't know. I'm like, I asked them to think about that, and they kind of give me this like, what am I producing? And so this notion of producing abstractions, even at higher level service industry. Okay, so that's kind of it. And I really like Paulo's, I wrote down the connection between action, rhetoric, and complexity, and like, how can those, or do those fit together? And I don't have a good answer, but I really like that. That's, I think, such a core question. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Kevin. There is also a question from Paulo and James. So I guess you two can ask your question, then we go back to Terrell.
Great. Thank you for the previous questions, Kevin, right? That's a great, I think that I want to follow or develop from there a little bit. So it's a kind of, and I do want Terrell to say something about this explicitly. Tackle the question. So having a critical reflection around reception doesn't mean that we don't want to receive. So I think that a question around should we still read Marx? I mean, sure, we can ask any question, but for me, I don't even consider that question because of that, because there are amazing ideas there. So I think what the implication of this book is to be aware and to help the reader to look at, instead of the reconstruction of that source or that voice is completely opaque and is authoritarian. Therefore, this is the Marx, this is a true Marx. It's about, and this is related to the methodology of thinking, I guess, or the method of thinking. It's about reading as a non-authoritarian practice. And this is not about not reading, it's the opposite. It's about being aware of the historicity that we inhabit in the left. It's about knowing that there is nothing new in some ways, and there are stuff that is new. So those two things are a dialogue in tension, right? And it's not get away with history and with the amazing legacy that we are ants, like working in an enormous legacy of people who were so serious about not just Marx, obviously, but the thing is that when we invoke these people and we bring them into a conversation, is how we do it. How do allow us to engage with them as provocations to do something in dialogue, something new, but at the same time, not new in a naive way, which would be not to honor that legacy. But I think that legacy, that tension between how we engage with an amazing, rich body of thought that comes, thinking about the left, and now I'm thinking from that point of view, and at the same time, how that doesn't become a cage, because what I think that there is a tension also in your book when looking at trying to engage Marxism in context, while at the same time looking how that context was kind of erased in the appropriations. But this is not to say this is the true Marx. The Marx that is about even your operations of looking at how, I mean, I enjoy so much, like how the Communist Manifesto came to be how the economic, the philosophical and economic manuscript in the 20th century, how they reemerge, all that, even that your operation, what you are showing is that your own you're not showing what is the true reconstruction, but we are showing by destabilizing these reconstructions, you are showing the instability of any, which doesn't mean that the task is not worth it and it's necessary. And I think to get away with it would be the wrong way to go in that regard. But I would like you to speak about these things more, like more, you know, like, yeah.
Thanks, Paulo. James and then Terrell.
I wanted to say something that I guess I didn't manage to say in my presentation because I ended up going a little bit off script. I tend to find it hard to resist the temptation to do that. So I apologize if anything that I said was poorly reflected upon. But I did think, you know, Gökbörü said something about kind of the method of Marx as being what might remain of value to people today. And it occurred to me that what I had wanted to say also was a sense of like there being some kind of sensibility, a core sensibility, if you will, that Marx inhabits, and that we can perhaps carry forward if we choose to do so. And that would be one that, you know, seems to place capitalism at the center of the analysis. And that made me think about, to take a different line of thought about post-structuralism, if you like, about Deleuze and Guattari saying that they were Marxists, but in the sense that they thought that, I mean, because they never really wrote much about Marx, you don't see lots and lots of references to Marx, but I just found a quote where they say in an interview with Tony Negri that they remained Marxists because they think that any political philosophy must turn on the analysis of capitalism and the ways that it's developed. So I kind of wondered whether that way of being Marxist would be acceptable to Terrell Carver, whether he agrees with everything or any of what Deleuze and Guattari actually wrote. Is that kind of a model, if you like, for taking Marx's work forward, just to be that kind of loosely inspired? The other question, I don't want to talk for too long, but sort of thinking about that image of the volcano, and then to think about kind of what happens after a volcano erupts is that the lava solidifies and it becomes a rock. And it's almost as though Carver's book is sort of trying to break away all that rock, the crust, if you will, that's formed because of all of these canonizations that have occurred, right? To take us back to like the magma of Marx or something like that, molten Marx, maybe. I wonder what Marx would think about the need for a book to do that, right? I mean, you know, because you talk about the way that he himself kind of did these selfies of himself, which kind of reifies himself in a way, right? And then obviously you also talk about the way that he kind of doesn't necessarily approve of, but goes along with Engels's translation of his, you know, ideas into a philosophy. You know, this was happening during Marx's lifetime, as you so helpfully point out. So I wonder what he would think about you writing this book and about the need for this book to be written for us to access kind of the living, I don't know, to use a sort of an image from John Stuart Mill, it's like there's a living truth to Marx as opposed to the dead dogma of Marx, right? The dead dogma being, you know, all the various Marxisms that have just canonized Marx, reified Marx, and so on. So those are kind of two questions, comments that I wondered if you could say something about.
Thank you, James. So Terrell, now to wrap this up.
Okay, I'm really delighted to do that. We're awash with metaphors and distinctions that fly around and stabilize for a moment and then they take off again. So it is a world of contingency in our activities, one way or another. Try to get hold of that through communicating to others, which fails more often. then it succeeds. And of course, in this case, I think it's succeeding quite dramatically according to my perception of it. So touching the volcano and the magma just quickly, I'd say it's a bit the other way around. The magma hardens, and guess what happens? Little plants and fungi and all kinds of creatures start colonizing it and doing their own thing. So in terms of the book cover, I hope that's the Marx that's there, and maybe he'd be delighted with it or not. I think we are kind of flipping back and forth between the man as he was, even though he wasn't the same man from age whatever 19 and until he died. And we're then confronting all the efforts to make him into a man as such, whom we can grasp in a way that we're usually not pleased that people try to grasp us. So we're all out of each other's grasp, and I don't pretend that I have you just because you've created a text for me to listen to. And I think we need to drop that a bit with Marx and consider the texts themselves as communicators. And we're lucky with him that we have a lot of texts. And so one way of getting them to communicate is to take on board the historical context, but often you don't particularly have to do that, because Marx is actually really good on the everyday in commodity producing capitalist societies where the capitalist mode of production prevails, in focusing on the everyday and the ordinary and the normalized in Lawson's, or where I worked when I was 16, which was McDonald's. He's really, really good at going into those situations and making them weird. So the opening pages of Capital, which actually I wasn't going to talk about very, very much or bring up, are really striking in the way he picks up the commodity and says, this, looks ordinary, it's just a thing and a commodity, isn't it? But actually start to think about it. Why has it got a price tag on it? How is it that these things exchange for each other, and the relations amongst themselves via markets control our lives? Why are you in work or out work? And what exactly is money? And there's some fantastic comments that relate that directly, and I think quite respectfully, back to indigenous communities who are sort of disdained for their worship of magic and charms and totem and taboo and all of that. And Marx is saying, just holds up a mirror and says, look at yourselves in that light. So as a way of queering and weirding out the normality, impressive as it is at Lawson's, etc., Marx is actually excellent. And I think he had a real sense of how this was sweeping over the world. And I think it simply alerts us to that kind of thing. He operated in lots of genres. I mean, he was always trying to find a genre that worked. Wasn't he? He didn't actually give public speeches very much, although there are a couple of occasions unrecorded, since he didn't have Zoom in 1848. And we don't know much about them. And then he was in contexts where public speaking wasn't a good idea. And indeed, many people who made public speeches in those days paid a very high price for it. But he worked around all kinds of genres, finding one that would work and one that would work for him, and not sticking with one. Because in a sense, he had the liberty of being a public but privately supported, not to a high degree, intellectual, and doing the activism that he tried to do, and not being too disappointed at the lack of success that actually came his way. So I think there's a lot there that's inspirational, but it doesn't necessarily work for everybody. But I think a certain generosity there, and getting on board with the idea that I'll close with here is that there's been quite an interesting kind of circle going around here between the book that you've read, what it is you say that it says and how that gets attributed to Marx as a speaker, which then comes back round to me. So it's a circle of texts spoken and written which have got authors. But we shouldn't presume that we can catch an author and biographize him or each other and then use that as a point of certainty for knowledge construction. It's a device, and it may help and it may hinder. So I'll leave it very much at that, and heartfelt thanks to everybody, and I'm really, really glad I read the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Terrell. There is one last question that has been asked in the chat that I would be loath to set aside. I'm not sure who is actually best to answer it, but whether it be Terrell or perhaps Paulo, but I read it aloud. So Satadru wants to know how the speakers would reflect on the implications of the fact that a reality of the modern left in the global south has been far away from Marxist value, but their political perception has been mostly viewed as Marxist. Anyone wants to jump in on that?
I will jump in and hand over to those from the global south or global east or somewhere other than the metropole where I'm sitting in the Anglophone world. So over to you guys.
Oh, so essentialist. I want to say something about I think it's on page 128 to 135. There is this beautiful question: how to describe a political failure without failing the political cause. And like sometimes, for instance, when we in Latin America discuss Venezuela or Nicaragua right now, that are going through an authoritarian or at least difficult path, to say the least, is interesting because that is, I mean, this is a very specific take on the question. It's just inspired me because there are other things I would say, like, okay, but the global south, the left in the global south does that only, and what about the global north, and what are those spaces? I mean, there is so much to say, to deconstruct around that question, but I'm going to say just this, not to take, to avoid taking so much time, is how, like, Terrell talks about how Marx speaks about failures in ways that enhance or like promote the political project instead of, and it's beautiful, like even for our intellectual practices, not just in politics, like thinking about failure and surprise and those things that dash our scripts as opportunities. I think that there is so much generosity there to explore. But one of the main issues is that the right in Latin America really uses those Marxist projects to, so I mean, quote unquote, obviously, to kind of totalize the left. And so if it's not Maduro or Ortega who do particular things, it's socialism, right? And that very slippery terrain where the failure of a particularity is expanded rhetorically to occupy a universal space. In this case, the universe of the left is really something that we need to talk about. It's fascinating. It's really problematic. And how politically doing the opposite, right? How a failure can become a tragic, heroic, rhetorical device, which goes back to the point that I don't think that Terrell resolved in his answers, but and I don't think it's maybe it's impossible to resolve that. The connection between rhetoric and complexity, right? Because rhetoric is great to become a political force, but then rhetoric seems to have a sort of I don't want to say authoritarian, but to simply I don't know how to put it. Like it seems that to reach the masses, to do stuff, you need to do some things at the intellectual level that are problematic, because at least from my, I don't know, I think that democracy has some relationship to minds that can deal with complexity and with nuance and so I find that there is a tension there. But this idea of failure and how failure of particular projects become a site of contestation themselves, right now in the global south is whatever that category means is complicated. But anyway, I think it's an interesting conversation to have.
Sure. Can I add something?
Quickly.
Just a line about that. But I think that there is performativity also in the label, so we have to take a look at that also.
Well, that was indeed brief enough. Thank you, Marcela. Well, we've gone a bit over time, but I think it's for the good. So all that remains is for me to thank all of you, Paulo for his work in putting together this roundtable, and all of your contributions. Terrell, of course, obviously, for the book. I think it's very easy to have a boring conversation about Marx, or to write a boring book about Marx, but this was all but. I think it was extremely stimulating, and the range of questions that we tackled reflects that, I think. So thank you, and well, hopefully see you in other panels later in the Congress.
And thank you, Thibaut.
Thank you so much.
Big thanks to everybody.
Thank you,
Great seeing
Terrell.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you too, man.